In the world of scholarship, activism, and education, few individuals have made as profound of an impact as our guest today. A celebrated historian and leader, he has dedicated his life to activating for equality, social justice, and LGBTQ+ rights. At Harvard, he broke ground as the first openly gay faculty member at the Kennedy School and continues to shape minds with courses that explore the complexities of queer history and politics. His work extends beyond the classroom, being featured in leading publications and documentaries. He is also a devoted public servant, contributing to pivotal movements like the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and serving on the President Obama's National LGBT Leadership Council. Please join me in welcoming Professor Timothy Patrick McCarthy.
Thank
Are
you,
there any
Christopher. Thank you. It's great to be with you.
are there any childhood books that particularly inspired you, and do you feel they influence your path toward becoming an advocate and educator?
Oh, for sure. I was, as a kid, a voracious reader. I was a slow reader, and it took me a long time to read things, but I read early. And so I got a bit of a head start. It helped that my grandmother was a retired public school teacher, and she helped to raise me in the early years. And both my parents are also public school teachers. My mom was a third grade teacher for many years, an elementary school teacher. So I was sort of raised by educators. So books were like everywhere, and they were strongly encouraged. And so when I think back, it's a great question because I mean I have to I'm older than you, so I have to go way back when you talk about childhood. But I don't know if there's a single book that set me flowing or that changed my life in that time. But there were authors and there were types of books that I was really drawn to. So when I was very young, Dr. Seuss was a staple in my home. I think I read every Dr. Seuss book. In fact, I wrote one of my college essays about a book named McElligot's Pool, which is about a little boy who is fishing in a little pool, and this old man comes by and said, well, why are you such a fool? Why are you fishing in McElligot's Pool? And then the kid starts to weave this fanciful, imaginary sort of world underneath the pool that stretches all over the globe, and the fish get increasingly big and wonderful. And it's really a book about optimism. It's a book about having hope when it seems a little bit foolish. And so that's a Dr. Seuss book that certainly stuck out to me. And I think as someone who is involved in social movements and advocacy, you have to have hope, right? Especially when you don't think there's any hope to have, or that it may seem foolish to other people. So that book certainly inspired me, and also all of the Dr. Seuss books that I read as a kid. They were just so imaginative and brilliant, and the illustrations as well as the stories and the rhymes always moved me. I think I also, as I grew older, my mother and I would often read together, and one of the authors that we read together was Judy Blume, and we read Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing and Blubber and some of these other books. Of course, she is an author who had a wide range of styles, and so there were other books that I know some of my peers were reading, like Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, which was a critical book for a lot of the young girls and becoming women who I was peers with at that time. But I remember reading some of Judy Blume's book, her more humorous books, and just laughing out loud with my mother, and those memories of us sitting wherever we were sitting, reading those books and just having deep gut busting belly laughter was something that was important to me, because the idea of laughing and having joy with people you love while you're reading and while you're thinking about storytelling was really important. And I think there were other kinds of things that were important to me. I was a huge Winnie the Pooh fan. And I think in some ways, the reason why I was drawn to Winnie the Pooh, I was also drawn to Sesame Street and Star Wars. These were all Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. These are all things that dominated in a good way, dominated my early childhood and young adolescence. And I think one of the through lines, I think, for all of those stories, particularly Winnie the Pooh, Star Wars, Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, even the Seuss books, and Judy Blume, is that they were all about relationships. And they were also all about people who were seeking relationships with people they could love and that they could have fun with and that they could do something productive with, whether you're learning to to count in Sesame Street or read or think about those kinds of things, or whether you're thinking about what it means to be kind to people and what it means to enter into a safe land of make-believe in Mr. Rogers, whether you're fighting a rebellion against the Empire in Star Wars, or whether you're going into the woods and having a poo party or birthday party. All of these childhood stories, whether they were books or beyond books, were things that I think drew me into them because there was community there, and there was joyful, loving, kind, purposeful community that was doing something. And I think part of that had to do with the fact that I was a bit of a weird kid. I was a misfit. I was adopted by my parents, and I didn't have any siblings. And we lived out in the country the first part of my childhood. So I was often in situations where I was the only kid among a world of adults. And I think those books also spoke to me because they took me to these wonderful places that I felt were very real, even though they weren't fully real, and helped me feel part of something, like I belonged to something bigger.
So in most of those books that you just mentioned, the ones like Winnie the Pooh and Star Wars, I know a lot of them don't actually cover any LGBTQ topics.
Right.
Is that something that maybe pushed you to become an advocate for LGBTQ plus?
It's very interesting you would ask that, because in some ways, I mean, especially now as I get older, and you sort of sometimes you look back and you see things that you didn't quite see, that you might have sensed when you were younger, but you didn't quite see clearly. And my first Star Wars figures were R2D2 and C3PO. And I remember they were among the only characters who were in all of the films, like, or the whole sort of series of Star Wars. And they were the first people you see and encounter, and they really are remarkable characters. And they're very different, but they were queer in some ways. I mean, C3PO, I look back now, and C3PO was like very queer. He was very smart. He was fastidious. He was a little annoying. He was brilliant. He was always fussing about everything. And it's no question in my mind that C3PO is queer, and that R2D2, who's like a little bit more butch than maybe than C3PO is someone who is his partner in all of these ways. And they go all over the galaxy together. And when they're away from each other, they miss each other. And it's just thing. And then I think back to Sesame Street, Bert and Ernie, right? I mean, one of the front covers of the New Yorker when New York State legalized marriage equality was a picture of Ernie and Bert sitting together on the sofa watching the news of marriage equality at home with their arms around each other. And I remember thinking, that too is kind of queer, right? And maybe they weren't just roommates and friends, maybe they were lovers or partners or husbands. And so when I think back, I think about the characters that I was drawn to, and even Pooh and his wild group of misfit friends, who ranged across species, among other things, were chosen family. These were people who were either in relationships that felt to me to be the relationships of love, even if they didn't ascribe to a kind of normative standard. But even the groups of people that, where you might not say they're gay or lesbian or queer, bisexual or trans, they are chosen communities and they're chosen families. And for queer people, that is such an important piece of things, because for many of us, for a lot of us, I mean, I think it's becoming less the case, but certainly historically, family has been a place for many of us of trauma, of rejection, right? Of suppression and repression, of real violence in some cases. And so many of us, I happen to have a very loving family, and I was very lucky in that regard. But I know a lot of people who sort of left home and never went back when they finally could. And because they knew they would never be accepted by their communities, their families, their schools, maybe their faith institutions in many cases. And they're sort of looking for something else. And what do they find? Hopefully, if they're lucky, they find friends, and they find lovers and loved ones, and they find people that they can build community with. And so when I think about all those communities that I saw in those texts and those stories, I think the chosen family idea, which was there in all of those stories, really was something that then became very real to me and very salient to me as I left home and came out and tried to figure out who I was and what I wanted to be in the world. And even today, I mean, my husband and I live in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is known to be a very, very queer, affirming, and accepting place. And there's a lot of misfits here in Provincetown who are glorious in their various ways. And none of these people am I related to by blood or even by immediate family bond, but these are people who have become my family, become my friends, and become my loved ones in ways that I think is really powerful. And I don't think that this is just something that queer people understand. I think lots of people understand what it means to search for belonging, to search for community when you're feeling lonely or isolated or misfit or not particularly part of something. But we all, I think, search for family in some form. And for me and for queer people, chosen family is very important. And it was there all along in those stories, even if the characters themselves weren't gay per se.
You've been teaching the Queer Nation course for several years now. Could you
Mhm.
tell us what inspired you to create this course and how it has evolved in response to the changing landscape of LGBTQ plus issues?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question, and it actually has a really a wonderful origin story. So I was the first openly gay and queer faculty member at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I joined the faculty in 2006. And so shortly there, I mean, I was already out, so they must have known when they hired me, or maybe they didn't, but they soon learned. And at the time, I was the only openly gay faculty member there, which again was a lonely and misfit existence. This is also a through line in my life at times, misfit certainly. And when I got there, there was nothing in the curriculum. There were no other faculty members who were even identified as LGBTQ, much less teaching anything that was related to it. And I had just gotten my PhD in US history, although I had not focused my attention on LGBTQ history or politics in graduate school. Everything that's on my syllabus for my Queer Nation course, I've read since I got my PhD. So in some ways, I've had to kind of like self-teach myself another round of graduate studies in this field, and to get to a place where I felt like I could comfortably and ethically and effectively teach this material and then write about it and so forth. And so this course came about because I thought there needed to be a course in the curriculum. And so I pushed for one initially, and it was turned down. And part of the reasoning for it being turned down was that they weren't the powers that be at the school didn't know that anyone would be interested in this topic. And that was in 2008, and that was at a time that I was actually working quite closely with the Obama campaign when Senator Obama was running for president, and I was part of his LGBT Leadership Council, and I did some work on the campaign in various places around the country. So I was actually doing gay work, LGBTQ work with the Obama campaign. And then he gets elected president of the United States, first Black president, who was at that time, without question, the most embracing presidential candidate and then president of the LGBTQ community. There's no question. I sometimes quip or joke that that Barack Obama will go down in history as the sort of Lyndon Johnson of the LGBTQ community. He was the kind of ally in chief, and I still think that that's very, very much true, and I'm grateful to him for that. So I thought, like, hey, I'm doing this gay stuff with Obama, like that's politics, that's government, right? That's LGBTQ stuff, so clearly it's relevant. And people said that no one would want to take the class. So I said, okay. And I didn't just pitch a class. I had a whole syllabus ready because I had met with students to see what they would want in a class like this. And they gave me all of these ideas, not just for one course, but for probably 10 courses. And so I tried again a couple of years later to pitch this, then with the students more behind me in terms of them pushing as well. So we were kind of getting at them from two ways. And then the response was no, people outside of the LGBTQ community won't be interested in this course, right? So first it was no one will be interested, then it was only queer people will be interested, and then later on, when students became actually more organized around demanding more diverse courses and faculty and so forth, there was a whole group of students that were part of this. They were called the Equity Coalition, and they were making really serious and quite aggressive in a good way, demands of the administration. And it was at that moment, right, that I thought, hey, maybe a third time's a charm and we can do this. And there's a longer backstory there, but this course ultimately was greenlit and I ended up teaching it, and I've taught it for the last 6 years. I'm teaching it again this semester, and it's still the only course in the curriculum. There are now more LGBTQ out faculty, but it's still the only course in the curriculum, and it's a course that looks at the intergenerational history of LGBTQ communities and movements, and it looks at that roughly from the middle of the 20th century through our present day, and it focuses its attention on what I call three Ps: protest, politics, and policy, and sort of looking at how queer people have protested and spoken truth to power and organized themselves, and then how queer people have been politicized, right, stigmatized and discriminated against in the larger sort of realm of society and culture, and then the policy realm, which is like how do laws and legislation work against us, but also over time work for us. And you mentioned the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I mentioned marriage equality. Those are just two very obvious examples of how the law and legislation have changed, how policy has changed over the years, in recent years, more in the favor of LGBTQ people, at least here in the United States. So that's the course. And the good news is that people want to take it, that yes, LGBTQ plus students want to take it. They come in droves. And yes, people who aren't LGBTQ want to take it, including people who are self-described allies, people who know nothing about this history, people who may have siblings or friends or children who have recently come out, and they want to know this history more so they can be better partners to those people in their lives. And this year we have, I think, 9 different Harvard graduate schools and 3 schools in the Boston area represented in the class, including the undergraduate college at Harvard. So it's a very diverse group of people, and I'm happy to say that the logic and reasoning behind the initial 2 rejections of the course have proven to be false over time.
Your work often intersects with critical issues like race, class, and gender. How do you see these intersections influencing LGBTQ plus activism, both historically and in contemporary movements?
So one way that I approach my work, my historical work, is through a kind of methodology or lens, what the late Howard Zinn called people's history. And I'm very interested in the histories of often untold or erased or marginalized in some way of ordinary folk, of ordinary people who have been marginalized and minoritized in American society over time. And so I'm really interested not just in people who are minoritized in terms of gender or in terms of sexuality, what we might broadly call LGBTQ plus folk, but I'm also deeply interested, and actually was interested in these communities beforehand, with African American communities and immigrant communities, labor communities of workers and the labor movement, right? So I've been interested in these kinds of histories, women's history, right, throughout my career. And one of the things that you realize is that in each of those communities and each of those movements, there are many different kinds of people, right? In the LGBTQ community, it's not just people who principally identify in some ways as a sexual or gender minority, right? It's also people who come from different racial and ethnic backgrounds and national backgrounds and migrant backgrounds and linguistic backgrounds and faith backgrounds and so forth. And so socioeconomic status and society. And so it's really important, if we're going to tell a broad and inclusive and diverse people's history, that we think really seriously about the multitudes and the intersections where all of us live and that all of us contain. And obviously there are frameworks for understanding this. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a law professor, critical race theorist at Columbia University and UCLA, someone whose work I've long been inspired by, and she's the one of the people who's credited with, or the first person who's credited with coming up with a framework or theory of intersectionality, looking at how people, and in her case, in her original scholarship, Black women, right, because of the intersection of race and gender and also of class, often were at the intersection of interlocking systems of oppression, that you couldn't understand a Black woman's experience without understanding race, gender, and class, and sort of thinking about how those things operate. And in her work, she's focusing on law and policy because she's a legal scholar and a civil rights a practitioner. And so she's really interested in that. And so my course, all the courses I teach, have intersectionality as a kind of framework and also as a practice, so that we don't miss anything, that we're not assuming that that all of one type of people were X and all of another type of people were Y. When I think about the intersections of of African American history and LGBTQ plus history, which are two areas that I've spent a lot of time in my life researching and teaching and studying and living, right? That LGBTQ history is African American history, and African American history is LGBTQ plus history. And there are all of these intersections and variations and multitudes and so forth that are part of any community and any movement. I also have this quote that I take from Walt Whitman, who was the great kind of democratic queer bard of the 19th century. And it's one that applies to my life, but I also think it applies to my work, because history is messy. And the quote comes from Song of Myself, one of his epic poems, and that was published in, I think, in 1855. And Song of Myself was part of the larger collection of Leaves of Grass. And in this particular moment in the poem, it says, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." And I think that for me, that's always been a wonderful way of capturing the kind of messiness of history, but also the beauty and the texture of it and the diversity of it.
You've authored several books, including Reckoning with History, Unfinished Stories of American Freedom. How does your research and writing influence the way you approach teaching and activism, especially within the context of your Queer Nation course?
Yeah. So the book Reckoning with History is a collection of essays by colleagues of mine that we went to graduate school together, and we all studied under the same mentor, Eric Foner, who the famous Civil War and Reconstruction historian who's written widely on all sorts of themes, including social movements and American radicalism. And Professor Foner was a huge inspiration to all of us, and he's several people have described him as America's finest living historian, and he's certainly still with us. And so we decided that we would, as a group of former students who are now teaching in the academy and doing our own thing, having been trained by him and by others, we decided we were going to put together a collection, which is fairly routine in academia, where when your advisor retires or comes close to retirement, former students come together to honor them in some way. And so we put together this collection of essays by his former students, all reckoning with different challenges of history and thinking about what are the unfinished stories of American freedom that we can still tell. Because one of his books was called The Story of American Freedom. And so, he's one of the central motifs of his work is thinking about how freedom, the meaning of freedom, changes over time, and what the meaning of freedom means to different groups of people and why. And so we put together this book, and I have an essay in it that's a bit of a memoir essay. It's actually my own sort of how I've come into and reckoned with history over time, not just the history that I research and write about and teach about, but the history that I've lived and that I am living in my own life. And so it's a personal essay that's woven together with historical analysis and all sorts of discussions about how history itself and the practice of history has changed over time, and African American history and LGBTQ history and so forth. The histories of American radicalism are sort of woven into the essay, as well as my own story. And it relates to that's the kind of history that I like to write and that I like to teach. I've always been interested in how we can connect the past and the present. Right? James Baldwin said that historians write with one eye on the past and one eye on the present. And I think that that's very, very true. And we can't, we arrive at the past in some ways searching for other folks and trying to understand other eras and ways of living. But we're also on a search for ourselves, or sometimes we can find ourselves in that sort of massive history that we're studying. And I certainly have felt that in my own career. And there have been many, many times where I've learned something about myself because I've been in the archives and read something or encountered something or have written about something, and something comes to me and I'm like, wait, oh, that makes sense. Not only for the past, but also for me in my own life. And that's also how I teach. And this is not something that everyone does. And I'm not saying that everyone has to do this, but I very much believe, as the old feminist mantra says, womanist mantra says, the personal is the political. I also believe that the personal and the political are also the pedagogical. And so that these things, you can't compartmentalize yourself, right? That getting back to intersectionality, you can't tear yourself apart and put all the different pieces of yourself in different boxes and store them separately, right? We're messy too. We contain those multitudes. And so I am very upfront, particularly in my Queer Nation class, that this is a history class that studies protest and politics and policy, but it's also a class where I start to enter into the historical record because I'm a person of a certain age, right? We celebrated the 50th anniversary, well, 55th anniversary of Stonewall this past year. And, you know, I'm 53, right? I was born just less than 2 years after the Stonewall riot in the West Village in June of 1969. And so, you know, all of this, you know, recent history of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and marriage equality and the you know, treatment for HIV, you name it. There are all sorts of the rendering illegal of sodomy laws, right? Anti-sodomy laws, right? All of that I've witnessed, right, firsthand, and I've been, you know, in some cases part of the movement for change. And so I think it would be dishonest for us and disempowering, frankly, too, to come into sort of history and not try to figure out how to connect those dots and not be honest about sort of when I say to my students that at some point the third person becomes the first person in my class. Whereas like when I'm talking about people historically who I did not know, I'll talk about they and them and, you know, people from a different past and refer to them in a particular way from a distance. But then at some point I start to enter into the historical record like we all do. And then it becomes more about me and we and us and our and those kinds of things change. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's actually really special and profound and actually very empowering to think of ourselves as living history, to not think of history as this dusty thing that we do someday in the future, right? That we're living history now. Sure, somebody and maybe many people who are historians and doing the work of historians later on in life, a century from now, may write about us, right? They may find this somewhere and think it's interesting and do an analysis of it or connect it to something, or they want to study you and how you've come of age and evolved over time and why this is important to you. They may study some of the stuff I've done or maybe us together, right? And yeah, sure, that will happen. We don't have a lot of control over that other than to live lives that are worthy of notice and that are valuable and impactful in some ways. But I think it's really important for us to think about ourselves in our lifetimes, right, as experiencing and living history so that we can then connect it to the past and also maybe to the future, that maybe we in our living histories can be bridges between a past that is hard to apprehend sometimes and a future that's not yet here. And so for me, history can function in that way as the connective tissue between the past and the present and the future. And I'm and weaving the personal and the political when it comes to minoritized lives, queer lives, right, is essential, right, to the teaching of this history and to the deep understanding of it.
Research has shown that LGBTQ plus teens are 4 times more likely than their peers to experience mental health challenges, including depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. This alarming trend is often linked to factors like discrimination, family rejection, bullying, and the lack of affirming spaces. As we continue to see setbacks in LGBTQ plus rights and representation, especially for trans and non-binary individuals, it raises urgent questions about how we can better support these vulnerable communities. Looking at the current state of LGBTQ plus rights, what do you think are the most pressing challenges we face today? How can policy and educational efforts work together to address these challenges?
Yeah, yeah. These are great questions. You've done your homework. You know, the big questions too. I like big questions, even though they're sometimes harder to answer. You know, there's a lot there. I think the first thing I want to mention is that are the statistics that you led with. Those should be jarring statistics for anyone, not just people in the LGBTQ community or elders or older people in the LGBTQ community. I have the great fortune of spending my life in educational institutions. I teach at Harvard. I teach graduate students and undergrads. I work with a lot of high schools. You know, I have a teenage niece. I'm around young people a lot, and I love that. I mean, it keeps me as young as I could possibly be kept. And so I love that. But it is very clear to me that those statistics tell about a reality that is really true. And there is a deep cause and effect. We know this. We know when there's bullying rampant in schools that the kids who are bullied have negative kinds of lived experiences, right? We know that when faith institutions demean and devalue and discriminate against people who are queer or people who are different from whatever the reading of the scripture is in that particular faith institution, we know that that has damaging impacts on people. I myself grew up in the Catholic Church. I'm no longer practicing Catholic because that was a traumatic experience for me, because the Catholic Church has, for all of its history, been deeply, deeply invested in and complicit in the discrimination and the dehumanization of queer people. And I just didn't want to be part of that anymore. And lots of people have similar kinds of stories. So we know that there's a cause and effect. We know when there's demeaning, devaluing, dehumanizing, and discrimination, we know that that has negative impacts, and it shows up in all of the mental health ways that you first led with. And so that, first of all, needs to be established and said as loud as possible, that the cause and effect, right, are deeply linked and they're long-standing and they have historical precedent. So we have to go at the cause in order to diminish and mitigate against and hopefully abolish the effect, right? There are lots of ways to do that, but we have to name that first. I think the other thing for me is always about the kind of violence that exists in a society or culture. What laws and legislation and practices and cultural beliefs are doing violence, literal violence in the fact of harming people physically, right? Or other kinds of violence, right? The kind of verbal violence that comes from people being, where people use language to belittle, or they don't refer to someone by the name or pronoun that they ask to be referred to as, right? That's violence. It's different from a violence of punching someone in the face, but it might feel like a punch in that moment, right? People who are barred from things or don't have access to affordable housing or healthcare. Those are all forms of violence. If you don't have access to healthcare, whatever ails you, whether it's physical health or mental health, you can't get treatment for, right? So that too is a form of systemic violence, even though, again, it may not be a punch in the face, but it maybe has even more long-term effects from that. So I think we need to be really clear about the cause and effect, and then we really need to go at those locations of violence, right, that are damaging and destroying our young people and many of us, right? Not just young people, but I'm concerned about young people because young people are the future. Young people are the next generation. Young people are what should give us hope, who should give us hope. And certainly that's been the case for me. And selfishly, I need that. The older I get, the more hope I need to cling on to, right? And my students and young people like you are those people who give me that hope. It's the easiest source, or the most accessible source and wellspring of hope for me is young people. But then I think there's also another dimension here, and it gets back to the question of representation and of seeing yourself, right? It's one thing to be seen and to be heard, right? And to not be discriminated against or not be bullied. It's another thing to see yourself represented, right? In the case, I mean, the number of students that have told me over the years that I was the first and only LGBTQ teacher they had ever had, right? Still, in the third decade of the 21st century, I have students this semester for whom I am their first queer teacher, right? So not that I represent everything or that that's like a major, social advance, but the more of us who are visible, the more of us who are out and representing, right? That means there are more representations, right? And when we think about books, right, the reason why people are trying to ban books and control curriculum is because those books and those curriculums seek to be more inclusive of diverse kinds of peoples, right? There's a reason why something like 75% of attempted book bans or successful book bans in the United States in the last calendar year are books that are either by or about queer people and people of color, right? 75% of those books, PEN America does a great job of tracking these things state by state, locality by locality. And the last 2 years, 2 years ago was the most number of banned book attempts and successful efforts in the history of the country since they've been keeping those data. What happened last year? It was even higher. What's shaping up this year? Even higher. So we're moving in the opposite direction in terms of representation when it comes to what's being taught in schools and what's available to students in schools. And, you can't, I mean, there's a famous kind of mantra that you probably are familiar with. It's like, you can't be it if you can't see it. and also representation matters. And those two things may seem like cliches, but they're true, right? When I think about the first time I saw a positive representation of a queer person, or even just a gay man, right? It was later in my life, right? And when I saw that and when I experienced that for the first time, there was a feeling of relief, of connection, of hope. And I think we all need to see in the histories we study, in the books we read, and the examples that are given to us, and the people who are teaching us, right? The rich diversity that is really the lifeblood of our democracy. And so that too is part of this larger project. I think people are more likely to be more joyful if they see positive representations of people living lives that they'd like to live. I don't think that's rocket science, but it's really a crisis right now, a huge challenge for educators like myself, for young people who are studying like you, and for the larger system of education. I mean, schools are really under siege, and part of the reason they're under siege is because schools are becoming these punitive places for policing minoritized people, right, including queer people.
Education plays a crucial role in driving social change. Based on your extensive experience with community-based initiatives like the Clemente course, how can we better use education to advance LGBTQ plus rights globally?
I've been involved in a number of kind of expansive educational projects over my time. I don't like to say alternative education project, but more expansive educational projects, meaning beyond the sort of classroom in a high school or middle school or university or college. And so I've been teaching this program called the Clemente course in the humanities, which is a college humanities curriculum. It's a year long, and it's accredited by Bard College, and it's directed towards lower income adults, or adults who have maybe started school and left school for any one of a number of reasons, or people who couldn't afford to take the transition from high school to college in some way. So it's meant to meet a much broader range and a much more diverse range of learners, adult learners, where they are, to try and give them this kind of exposure and access to a humanities curriculum that is credit bearing. So if they go through the successfully pass successfully go through the program, they get 6 college credits from Bard College in upstate New York, and then they're able to transfer those. So the program becomes in some ways a bridge back to school, or a bridge to school for a lot of folks who are in our program. And this program's been going on since 2001 all the way through the present day. I'm teaching, I think this is my 24th year teaching it, and I directed it for a number of years as well. And there's a program here, Clemente course in Boston. There are 5 more programs throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and then there are dozens of these programs throughout the country and the world. And so that's just one model of how to do things. But I think if education is going to be in full service to helping to serve as an antidote to the worst things in our culture, education has to be accessible and affordable to all. And that means that for those of us like myself who teach in elite institutions or research universities, right, which are not always affordable or accessible by any means, that we have to, at least this is my belief, we have to expand our horizons of how we teach and what we teach, right? Whether that means going online, whether that means teaching in prisons or in reintegration programs, whether that means teaching in things like the Clemente course, whether this means trying to figure out ways to redistribute, say, the resources of Harvard to meet the needs of people who may not ever come there as students. And one example of that actually is this new program that I have just helped to launch at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard. It's a new program on global LGBTQI plus human rights. And one of the things that we're doing this fall is we're convening a summit of 20 leading LGBTQI activists from across the globe, from 19 different countries, who are working, some of them in the most treacherous areas where there are no rights or protections to be spoken of, and we're going to bring them here. There's a 3-day training. They're going to do some of the teaching, we're going to do some of the learning, we're going to do some of the teaching and training, they're going to do some of the learning, and it's really meant to create a kind of incubator for ongoing collaborations and movement building work globally to meet the most treacherous challenges that LGBTQI people are forced to confront all over the globe. And in the spring, we're going to be launching an online training module that will really scale up the ability to reach more people. The summit will include 20 or so folks, but the online program will be able to accommodate hundreds and ultimately maybe even thousands of people who could benefit from the free teaching and training and education that we're providing. It wouldn't be a degree program, right? It's not that they're going to come and get a degree, but that they're going to access this in order to help them do their organizing work in ways that they haven't yet done. So I'm really invested in trying to figure out how we can open this whole thing up at a moment when education itself is under siege. And I think part of the reason why schools, whether they're K through 12 schools or colleges and universities, are in the crosshairs of the culture war and are being attacked in many ways, is whether you talk about book bans or curriculum control or attacks on DEI programs or affirmative action programs and the like. Schools are under attack because they have the power and the potential to do the work I was just describing. And as they become more diverse, as we have more different types of students, including first-gen students who are the first people in their families to walk through the hallowed gates of the places that I've taught in, right? That means that there's an opportunity there, right, to expand and redistribute and transform how we think about teaching and learning, and what then that teaching and learning can do in terms of ripple effects of change in the world. And I'm a big believer, I'm like an evangelist for this much more expansive and inclusive, accessible and affordable education. And I understand as a Harvard professor that there's an irony in me being an evangelical for that. It's not easy work, and we're nowhere near it in terms of it being a reality. But in my own way, and I know lots of people who are committed to this, colleagues that I've worked with in various contexts and institutions who are also committed to this. And I hope that that's the direction we're going in, because I do think that, as someone said to me recently, like, teachers are the people who teach everybody else, right? Every other profession starts in a classroom. And so schools of learning and teaching and educational institutions are vital, right? If we are to figure out in some way someday how we can all live together, right? And not just in tolerance of one another, but in full embrace and understanding of one another, right? I mean, what does it mean, going back to those children's book, what does it mean to create a version of a poo party globally, right? What does it mean to win the rebellion finally and vanquish the empire, right? What does it mean to build communities like Sesame Street that include people and puppets and all sorts of things, and they get along famously and they love each other? Like, what would that look like? And I sound gauzy and crazy probably in some ways, and people have accused me of those things before, but I believe deeply that schools can help get us there at their best, and they should, because they can.
I want to extend my gratitude to Professor McCarthy for his lifelong commitment to social justice, both inside and outside the classroom, is truly inspiring. From his groundbreaking work at Harvard to his leadership in the LGBTQ+ community and his powerful forthcoming book, Stonewall's Children, he's shown what it means to use education and activism to create a meaningful change in the world. We're incredibly grateful for your tireless dedication to fighting for equality and opportunity for all. It's been a true honor to have you with us today.
Christopher, thank you for inviting me. This was such a delightful conversation. You're doing great work and you have great questions, and I'm sure you have a great future ahead of you, so keep it up.